rich, full music of the organ. And now, everyone can play an organ, the M&E electric organ. Yes, you can play the beautiful new M&E organ right from the start, and no lessons are needed. The M&E electric golden pipe organ is a real reed organ. It has 27 black and white keys. That's more than 2 full octaves. And its rich tones are like those of the most expensive professional organ. Just plug it into your AC house current, turn on the switch, and play your favorite tunes, chords and all. No lessons, no hours of practice. The whole family will love playing the M&E electric organ. Ask for it at your favorite store. Be sure it's the M&E organ with free, easy-to-play songbook and a full year's guarantee, and priced at only $20.
M&E electric organ. That's a good thing to know about and a good thing to have. Now we're getting ready for our rocket series. We're getting ready, so fasten your safety belts and lean back and get ready to escape from Earth. Ever since man first looked up into the sky and saw a bird, he has wanted to fly. And ever since man looked up and saw the stars, he wanted to fly among them. He wanted to know them. He wanted to touch one. From the earliest days of Greek mythology of Daedalus and Icarus and their wings of feathers which melted when they got too close to the sun, man has dreamed and tried and failed and dreamed again. And now he is on the edge of space. This year, man will actually leave the Earth's atmosphere in a rocket-propelled ship, and after a short flight return into the atmosphere and back into the Earth. The vehicle is the rocket ship X-15. It was built in California. The man who will fly the X-15 on its first flight into space is a test pilot named Scott Crossfield. This month, he will begin short glide tests, and gradually he will increase the range, and sometime this year will actually leave the Earth's atmosphere and return. We've arranged to speak with Scott Crossfield about how he's preparing for this flight. He is somewhere out in California in the Los Angeles area, and we have a special telephone line into him now. We'll find out now if he's ready, and while we speak to him, we'll actually watch him making his preparations. Hello, Scott Crossfield? Hello, Scott. Scott Crossfield out there in California? Hello, is Scott Crossfield out there? Scott Crossfield. Hello.
He was on before us.
Well, we're having a little difficulty getting Scott Crossfield. He's out there and the line is in there. We'll get him in a moment. Now, Scott Crossfield? Actually, he's undergoing a very serious series of tests now that have to do with the gravitational force he will meet, with the speeds he will travel, with the pressures his body will have to undergo. Also, his ship will also be there. Hello, Scott Crossfield. This is the G suit that Crossfield will be wearing, and he is actually being put into it and put to a series of tests in his centrifuge in a Navy installation out at Johnsville, Pennsylvania. In this, he is whirled around at tremendously high speeds. There he is being strapped in now. These high speeds will approximate the speeds that he will get when he accelerates out of the atmosphere and deaccelerates when he re-enters the atmosphere. There are many instruments attached to Crossfield while this goes on, instruments which measure his reactions, instruments which tell them how much a man can bear on his trip into outer space. If you've ever been on one of these things in Coney Island, you get an idea, but this is many, many times faster and the G-force is 9, and sometimes it peaks at 12, which means if you weighed 200 pounds, you would feel like you weighed 2,400 pounds. Another problem is how you would go about escaping from a rocket ship if you hit any trouble. To overcome this difficulty, they have been experimenting at Edwards Air Force Base with a dummy on an ejection seat. Here Scott and the engineers set the dummy into a rocket-propelled sled. Now the dummy is in the sled, and soon he will be ejected. There goes the canopy, and there goes the dummy. Actually, those ailerons open up and become almost wings. Sometimes the tests failed. And if they did, they went back and improved them again. They made a mock-up of the X-15 out in California, and Scott Crossfield was able to get in the cockpit dressed in the suit he will wear on his trip into outer space. This gives him the feeling of how it will be and gives him a chance to check the equipment, and also gives him a chance to familiarize himself with the instrumentation. Another way of familiarizing himself with what his trip will be into outer space is on the X-15 flight simulator. This can be plotted as though to actually put him in on his flight pattern. The problems are fed into the machine, and he has to solve them by using the equipment that he will be using on his flight, which will last for a few minutes, but which will carry him hundreds of miles out. Scott Crossfield is the chief test pilot at North American, and he was present when the X-15 first was rolled out of the hangar on October 15th, 1958. The product of a tremendous amount of research and effort and careful studying. The product of many tests, some not directly connected with the X-15, but tests made by other pioneers down through the years. Tests which led to the concept and the construction of the X-15. We're sorry we weren't able to speak with Scott out there in California. We hope sometime, perhaps next week or the week after, to do it. We certainly wish him the very best of luck on his trip out into outer space. But pioneers build on the work of other pioneers. And rocket flights and rocket-propelled equipment were used for warfare and for fireworks back in ancient China more than 1,000 years ago. As a matter of fact, the first attempt at rocket-propelled flight was by an ancient Chinese gentleman. China, being the birthplace of rockets, would naturally have been the birthplace for the man's first attempt. A man named Wan Hu set himself up on a sled with 47 rockets. And he had 47 coolies to light each of the 47 rockets. They ran. Mr. Hu just sat peacefully, waiting to be launched. I'm afraid that ended attempts at rocket-propelled flight for some time. However, back in the 1920s, serious efforts were made at liquid-propelled rocketry. And one of the early pioneers in this whole field, as a matter of fact, a founder of the American Rocket Society, is a gentleman named G. Edward Pendray. And Dr. Pendray, I think the boys and girls don't often get to see real live pioneers, and so we're delighted to have you here with us today.
I'm delighted to be here. You know, I don't feel as old as all this makes me seem.
Yeah, I know. Actually, this is a commentary, I suppose, on how quickly the whole field of rocketry has opened up in these past few years. Actually, How far back did you begin shooting rockets?
Well, we began experimenting with liquid fuel rockets about 1930, but we weren't, of course, the first. The earliest liquid fuel rocket was shot by Dr. Robert H. Goddard, who was a professor of physics at Clark University, and he'd been experimenting with rockets of various kinds since as early as 1915 or 1916.
We have some films of Dr. Goddard, as a matter of fact, and some of those early experiments, and we're going to put them on now and wonder if you can tell us a little bit about Dr. Goddard and the significance of his experiments.
I'll try.
There, for instance, is one of the early rockets.
Yes, this is one that Dr. Goddard called Nell.
That was pretty primitive back in those days, wasn't it?
Well, this was quite a complicated rocket, though, of course, by today's standards, it would seem quite simple. But as you can see, it's a long rocket. And some of these rockets built by Dr. Goddard got as high as 2 miles, which was quite a shot. And they had all the devices in them that the German V-2s later had. You can see this one is steered by a gyroscope.
So actually, he led the way, and did he publish any papers on that?
Yes, he published a very important document published by the Smithsonian Institution in Washington called A Method of Reaching Extreme Altitudes. It was a very scientific paper, but in it he not only showed that rockets could work in a vacuum and could carry weights to high altitudes, but he actually proved that it would be possible to shoot a rocket to the moon. And he had an idea for landing a few pounds of flash powder on the moon so we could see the flash when it hit, and we could tell we'd hit the moon.
This is back in 1920?
Back in 1920, yeah.
Well, and you were, of course, shooting them off about 1930. What did people think about you in those days, you and your associates who were going around shooting rockets?
I think they mostly thought we were crazy. We had a great deal of difficulty with the neighbors, you know, and the police didn't like us very much either. There wasn't any way to get a permit to shoot rockets around New York City, so we would build rockets and get all ready to launch it, take it down early in the morning, set up our launching stand, load our fuels in, fire the thing, and then after the shot, get away from there as fast as possible.
We actually have another film clip now, Dr. Pendray, of you actually loading up a rocket and getting ready to shoot it. Now, there you go. There you are.
Oh, yes, this is our rocket, American Rocket Society's rocket number 2. That's me putting the liquid oxygen in it. This was considered a very dangerous thing to do in those days. We didn't know much about it.
You got the choice, huh?
You can see we had to put gas in, and now it's about to go off.
What'd you do? How did you actually trigger it?
Well, it had a torch, and then we pulled a string to release the valves.
Well, that one didn't go very high, did it?
No, but it was a most triumphantly successful shot because it was the first one we had that went at all.
Oh, really? Well, what actually, how did you get all the material? How did you build a rocket? There was no place you could buy the material.
No, that's the reason for having a society. There were a number of us, and some of the men had lathes or shops in their basements or in their attics, and they built the rockets in the wintertime. We got metals from the aluminum company, and we got liquid oxygen from the air reduction company. We didn't have any money, you understand, so we made officers of those companies members of our board of directors. They used to call me Chisel Pendray because I had all sorts of ways of getting things for nothing in those days, and a good thing it was, too, or we wouldn't have been able to do any of this work.
It's amazing that when you think of where we are today, that these were the beginnings of rocketry. Well, now, what was going on in other countries while the American Rocket Society was shooting off their rockets?
Well, of course, there was a good deal of work going on in various other countries. There were rocket experimenters in Italy and in France, and there was quite an active group in Germany, the group that later, that was led by Willy Ley and Werner von Braun, and the other folks whose work finally led to the development of the V-2.
Who actually were over there in 30...
about 1930, we visited, 1931, I beg your pardon, we visited the German group and saw them carry on some liquid fuel rocket experiments, and met Willy Ley and others at that time. This was, of course, before they'd gotten the backing of the German government, and they were amateurs like we were in those days.
Well, now, wasn't there something going on in Austria by a man named Schmiedel at the time?
Yes, there were a number of male rocket experiments. These were not so much to try to develop rockets as to see if there wasn't some practical use you could have for them. Mr. Schmiedel was the first of the male rocket men, and it happens that I have a cover of one of his earliest mail rocket envelopes here. This was shot in 1931. Mr. Schmiedel shot this from between two towns, Schuckel and Radegund, over a mountain.
I wonder if we can come in maybe a little bit tighter and see this, because this is a very significant and very rare treasure I am holding in my hand now. There's actually Schmiedel's signature is right up there, and it says V7, which is the name of his rocket, wasn't it?
Yes.
And this was actually carried in a rocket to its destination in 1931.
Yes, about 2 miles. It was several miles between these towns by the way the road ran around the mountain, but this is a practical device.
What else you have
And
there?
here are some other ones. This was a British experiment at the same time, and this rocket exploded. It says on the back that this cover was damaged in the explosion of the rocket. Here are some rocket experiments that were made in India. Both of these are India.
You know, this one on the back of it, this is very interesting. On the back of it says, contents of rocket. 1 tube quinine, 1 tube Pepsodent, 1 tube iodine, 1 tin butter, and so forth. And they were giving you the list of what they carried.
Sound like a commercial, doesn't it?
That's right. Well,
this is an American experiment in 1936 at Greenwood Lake in New York. I was present.
Oh, really?
At this experiment. It wasn't one of mine, but I was happened to be present there and was interviewed on the radio in that
it
time.
says via first American rocket airplane flight. Well, these are fascinating to think that way back then in the 30s they were carrying mail by rockets, not regularly, but the fact that it was done at all, I think, is a significant one. I understand that they also were carrying out some pretty weird experiments with rockets at this time. We have some film clips of these here. I think you'd be interested in seeing. You're probably familiar with them, where some attempts were made, for instance, on motorcycles there by rockets.
Oh, yes. I think
Not a
this
very
is
happy
German experiment.
Yeah, not a very happy ending, I'm afraid.
Well, that's the reason they were called experiments, you understand?
So experiments aren't always supposed to succeed. Now, here's a gentleman, I think, who decided he was going to be the fastest ice skater in the world.
Yes, this is another one that didn't... It was a sort of an experience I don't think anybody should try to have.
And yet,
Pretty nearly set him afire.
well, he's game. He's at it again, and
Whoop.
with not much greater success.
A ground loop, huh?
Yeah, actually, Opel, though, had a car.
Oh, yes. So
Looked
this
like it
is
really went.
It went very fast, but of course not very far. It takes a lot of fuel to drive a car, and a car really can't go fast enough to use rockets efficiently.
Now, you mentioned before, so that was interesting, you said Willy Ley and the others before they got the backing of the German government. And that really gave rocketry a pretty strong boost, didn't it? Because I don't know if our boys and girls out there would know this, but after the World War I, the Germans were forbidden to build airplanes to any large extent, so they turned to rockets. Actually, Mr. Hitler turned to rockets as an official act of the government to support them. Is that right?
Well, this is what I understand. You know, of course, this was all a secret at the time, and we could only hear around the edges, so-called. But as we see it now, the Germans did a great thing for rockets, even though one deplores the use they put them to.
Well, now here are some films, for instance, of some of the early rocket experiments which were carried on in Germany by the Nazis, who were using this, as we say, for dreadful ends, but like so many things which are start out having a dreadful end, they often turn out being somewhat beneficial. Now, of course, as you say, experiments didn't always succeed, and I think this is important for anybody who wants to be a scientist to understand.
It's very important because it's the things that you learn both from the failures and successes that make it possible to go on to the next step.
This is one of the most spectacular failures, I would say. Of course, I've seen something like that in our country, I think.
This is the one that fell over. Oh, it's a terrible sight. Think of all the thought and effort and planning that went into that to have it end this way. We used in our early days to spend 6 months, we'd say 6 months to build a rocket, 6 seconds to shoot it.
Well, of course, after those failures came the war and the V2s, and those, of course, were built, as you say, on Goddard's original experiments back in 1920, and some of the, probably, American Rocket Society and the early experiments of Ley and von Braun.
Well, at least Goddard had done it before they had. There's some controversy as to whether they invented all the things originally or whether they got some ideas from Dr. Goddard. It's very hard now to decide what the truth may have been, of course.
But at any rate, as this footage will show, they were quite successful finally in launching the V2 rockets. And when they did some terrible damage.
Yes. It's a nice shot, isn't it?
Unfortunately, it's on its way to wreak some terrible destruction and havoc. And it would be nice if we could separate that part from the rocket flight itself, but unfortunately, it's part of history. And it did wreak some terrible destruction on England and on London particularly. Now, after the war, what happened with the men who invented the rockets, or actually who worked on them in Germany?
Well, the group that were at Peenemünde that developed the V-2, some of them escaped to the west and were overtaken by our army and brought to this country. These are the men like von Braun and others who have done so much to help us develop rockets in this country. Another large group were captured by the Russians and were taken to Russia. The Russians there, I understand from von Braun and others who knew them, got them to write out all their ideas about rockets, show them how the German V-2s operated, and the Russians, like ourselves, captured a number of V-2s which they experimented with. I believe that none of the Germans are now working with the Russian group. They learned all they could from them, then sent them back to East Germany, and the Russians have carried on. In this country, we have welcomed the Germans. Most of them are now American citizens. They're one of the main teams in developing our space flight program, as you know.
As a matter of fact, after the war, there was a series of developments from the Viking, from the V-2, including the Viking and others like that, which bridged the development of the V-2 onto the modern-day rocket. There's a shot, for instance, we have here, I think, of an Aerobee, which was kind of a bridging device, and which actually, I think, is still being used for research, isn't it?
Yes, well, we shot more than 100 V-2s, I believe, and then we developed rockets of our own.
She goes. Actually, we started using it for upper air research as well as for military uses.
Yes.
Well, now, this thing has gone pretty fast, hasn't it, this development of rockets? Has it gone as fast back there in the 20s when you and your other friends had formed, I understand, the American Interplanetary Society before the Rocket Society, is that right?
Well, you see, we had no idea how difficult all this was going to be, and we had done so much writing and talking ourselves that we thought we'd be on the moon in a couple of years. So we did call it the American Interplanetary Society. But after we had shot a few rockets ourselves, we saw that we had a long, long road to go, and we also wanted to interest engineers in our work, so we changed the name to the American Rocket Society. This didn't mean that we were any less interested in getting to interplanetary space, but rather we thought this new name would be more attractive to young engineers who might not want to risk their reputations on such crackpot ideas as space flight. And it worked as we planned. We began to get a number of young engineers to join the society, and many of the key people in the rocket and guided missile and space flight program today came into this work in those days, in the middle 30s. Young engineers who were just graduating from college. As you know, there was a depression at that time, and many of them found difficulty getting jobs. They were able to keep their hand in while this rocket experimental work, and many of them have made careers out of it, and now, as I've said, are key people in this whole development. This, I suppose, is one of the principal contributions of the American rocket.
As a matter of fact, the first practical liquid oxygen engine with, regenerative engine, if I can, I can't even say it, much less understand it, but at any rate, a man named Wilde, James Wilde, invented it right in your backyard.
That's right. He was one of the young men who came in. He was a graduate of Princeton and had no job in his first year, and was happy to work on rockets and turned out to be a real genius. Unfortunately, he is dead now, but his name will certainly go down in the history books as the man who made the first successful regenerative liquid fuel rocket motor. This is the kind of a motor that later drove the German V-2s and now drive most of the large, high-altitude, long-range liquid fuel rockets.
Now, what about this problem of youngsters who want to find out about rocketry and want to do it by going out and shooting their rockets like you shot yours?
Well, it worries us a good deal because there seem to be thousands of young people making rockets, and many of them are having accidents, and it's a terrible thing. I think that young people should not try to build rockets. It's very dangerous. It's dangerous even for professionals, because even the professional engineers have serious accidents with all the protection they can have. And young people who make these in their attics or cellars or out in the backyard are so likely to have explosions, which may not kill them, but might destroy their eyesight or blow off a hand, and they can never, therefore, become the engineers they might have had they studied had they read, had they thought about it. A young person can, instead of making rockets, can make models, he can make designs, he can study mathematics, he can read about what others are doing, he can prepare himself for college where he can learn to be an engineer and really make the contributions that will take man into space. But if he destroys himself when he's young simply to shoot a rocket a few hundred feet high, he has not only ruined his own chances, but he may have deprived the world of the great inventions that he might have made had he taken the other course.
What do you, Dr. Pendry, well, first of all, that's a very important point, and I'm glad you took the time to make it. And now, just before we let you go, since you are an early pioneer and have seen this thing through from its earliest days, what do you look for, just briefly, in the year to come or the years to come, next couple of years?
Well, I think we will hit the moon during this calendar year, and perhaps we'll send satellites around the moon. We also may send a satellite out in the vicinity of Mars or Venus. I believe that within 5 years we will land men on the moon and return them safely to Earth, certainly within the next 10 years. And within a few years after that, maybe 15 years from now, we may actually be placing a colony, a permanent colony on the moon for astronomical observations and maybe as a staging place for long-range voyages to Mars and Venus, also manned flights.
I can see that you're still a pioneer, Dr. Pendry.
I have lived all my life hoping to be one of the first people to go to the moon. I'm afraid that I may have gotten a bit old for it now, but I still am rather well packed up and quite prepared to go if I could be convinced it would be reasonably likely to get there.
Dr. Pendry, thank you very, very much for stopping by and talking to us about rocketry. In the weeks to come, we will be speaking with the men who will be designing and building the rockets that Dr. Pendry has been speaking about, the rockets that may someday take us to the moon. Next week, we'll be speaking with Dr. Hal Ritchie. I'm sure you know Dr. Ritchie, Dr. Pendry. Dr. Ritchie is the Vice President of the Rocket Division of Thiokol Chemicals. He's flying in from Los Alamos to be with us. He's going to talk about the basic principle that drives a rocket and that also drives a balloon when you let the air out. It's called action and reaction. And he's an authority on jet propulsion, and here's a man who can tell you all about what makes a rocket go. Now, as a matter of fact, our friends who've been here with us today, the boys and girls who've been here with us today, will be getting rockets and some other things, such as rockets, some models, such as Dr. Pendry was speaking about, from Polk's Hobby Department Store down there at 5th Avenue and 32nd Street. And there's lots more where that came from down there at this House of Hobbies. They have crafts and toys from all over the world, and they cater to people from 7 to 77. As a matter of fact, thank you, I can show you. This is a 3-stage rocket. The Vanguard, huh? And you can put that together yourself, and that's better than shooting them, I'll tell you. Right like so. And the girls will be getting a doll craft and things like that. Next week, we'll be back here at the same headquarters of World of Wonderama, and we'll be talking with a conductor of a symphony orchestra. We'll be giving the second lesson for our dog training program. And if you, again, have any questions that you want to ask Bob Elliott about your dog, not only in training, but how to feed them, how to break them of some of the habits dogs get into, maybe we can even show you the address here in a moment of how to write in and where to write here at Channel 5 on East 67th Street in New York, and we'll be glad to hear from you. As a matter of fact, if you want to send us pictures of your dog, we'd be glad to get them too. We'd like to see the dogs that are sitting there in front of the television sets, and we could trade pictures. I can send you see my dog, and I'd like to see yours. We'll see you next week then on World of Wonderama. Bye.